Hi friends, I'm Sarah Jo Strawberry, and today I just want to talk about the reverse engineering of a Hogwarts Potions Master. Settle in, students. Class is in session. Well, I've taken these off because that is hurting my eyes. So I have been wanting to make this particular video since I made my first video, my Professor Sharp deep dive. I had the idea to maybe try to break that video down into shorter videos where I could expand on certain points, and the one I really wanted to expand on was the process of getting to Professor Sharp through reverse engineering from previous potions masters, Severus Snape and Horace Slughorn. So, let us begin. The three best-known Hogwarts Potions Masters are all in some way connected to each other. Professor Aesop Sharp most likely taught Professor Horace E.F. Slughorn, who then took over the Potions Master mantle from a retiring Professor Sharp, and later taught Professor Severus Snape, who then took over as Potions Master from a retiring Professor Slughorn, and then Professor Slughorn came back and took the position back from Snape. But I digress. Chronologically, we have a straight through line of these characters and how they relate to one another, but these characters were developed in the reverse order, so it's only natural that most likely there was inspiration for Professor Sharp taken from both Snape and Slughorn, and that in some ways Slughorn was meant to have some similarities to Snape as well as some contrasting points. And when you do look at and compare these three characters, there are some clear similarities as well as blatant differences in mind. Professor Sharp is definitely heavily influenced by Professor Snape, with their similar physicalities, appearances, as well as their similar names, but they have some diverging paths on their paths in life, their journey through life, that later on define some of the differences of those characters. I'm going to pause here and take off this coat because it's really annoying. I'm sitting on this and trying to keep it in place, and it's way too distracting, so quick costume change and we'll be back.
A few moments later.
Hydration. You might see moments where I'm looking down because I have my notebook in front of me with all of my fun various notes. I do also just want to mention that I will be making references to either my Professor Sharp deep dive or some of my other videos. So if you haven't checked those out, I will leave links in the description, as well as links to my Professor Sharp playlist, and I'll put different cards up here. Here's one for the Professor Sharp playlist. Hopefully I'm on the right side. Maybe it's over here. It's somewhere up here on the screen, because it will come up a few times, but to start, first, I want to talk about the timeline of the Potions Masters. Before we really delve into that, I want to give a few disclaimers, which are that this timeline is based on my theories and my assumptions that 1. Slughorn was at Hogwarts at the same time as Dumbledore, as stated by Molly Weasley, but was perhaps a year younger than Dumbledore. I just personally was kind of throwing in there maybe they weren't in exactly the same year, but they were students about the same time and knew each other. 2, that the Auror memo found in Professor Sharp's office, dated December 31st, 1875, was from his first or one of his first Auror assignments. 3, that Sharp became Potions Master in 1886, and I get this year from the idea that presumably Professor Ronen had some seniority over Professor Sharp, as he was head of Slytherin, and we know that Professor Ronen started at Hogwarts in 1883. As he says, it's been 7 swift years since his start at Hogwarts, when we ask him.
Well, it's been what now? 7 swift years.
And this year also comes from the idea that Sharp was far along and highly respected in his Auror career at the time of his injury, judging by being offered to head the recruitment program after no longer being able to be actively on the field.
I enjoyed a great deal of success as an Auror.
Because of this, I'm guessing he had to have had about a decade of experience. So that would have him being injured / starting at Hogwarts in approximately 1885. And as he says to Professor Weasley,
You say that every year, Matilda.
indicates that he has been at Hogwarts for a few years as of 1890, so I gave that approximately 1887, so landing in the middle of 1885 and 1887 is where 1886 comes from. The fourth and final disclaimer is that this also comes from my theory, my assumption, that Professor Sharp never found a cure for himself and returned to being an Auror, or did find a cure for himself but stayed at Hogwarts anyway, and stayed on as Potions Master until he retired at approximately 77 years old. So, the timeline itself, my hypothetical timeline. We start with Professor Aesop Sharp, who was born July 1st, August 1st, or September 1st of 1854, and this is something that I delve into in my Professor Sharp deep dive, how I come to these approximate dates for his birthday, so check that out if you want to see how I came to that conclusion. He then, by that we can estimate, started as a student at Hogwarts in 1865, graduating in 1872, where he then started his Auror training, which he did until 1875, when he started his Auror career. So now we move over to the next Potions Master timeline here, as we now have our first overlap of timelines, with Horace Slughorn, who was born April 28th, 1882. Professor Sharp then is injured and starts at Hogwarts around 1885, 1886, and Professor Slughorn is a student at Hogwarts from 1893 to 1900, so being taught by Professor Sharp, who continues to be Potions Master until 1931, when he retires. And this is where Professor Sharp's timeline ends. We don't know if or when he dies, so we end here with Professor Sharp in 1931, moving on to Slughorn's tenure as Hogwarts Potions Master, which he takes over from Professor Sharp, and we don't know when he starts as head of Slytherin, but at some point in this time frame of 1931 to 1978, and during this time that Slughorn is teaching at Hogwarts, Severus Snape is born January 9th, 1960, and is a student at Hogwarts from 1971 to 1978. A few years after Snape graduates from Hogwarts, Professor Slughorn retires in 1981, and Snape takes over the mantle of Potions Master, as well as head of Slytherin. Snape serves as Potions Master from 1981 to 1996. That is when he becomes Defense Against the Dark Arts Professor from 1996 to 1997, and in the meantime, Professor Slughorn returns to Hogwarts in 1996 as Potions Master again. In 1997, when Dumbledore dies, Snape becomes headmaster and serves as headmaster from 1997 to 1998. And when he becomes headmaster, Slughorn also takes back over being head of Slytherin. And we now have the end of Snape's timeline when he dies on May 2nd, 1998. And we conclude with Slughorn, who stays on as Potions Master and head of Slytherin until retiring again around 2011. Next, I want to look at what I call the Potions Master Vitals. These are their first impression, factual, physical, and personality traits that we see, and comparing and contrasting them, showing those similarities and blatant differences. To start with some similarities, all three are of course Hogwarts Potions Masters and members of Slytherin House. Their surnames all start with S, but when it comes to their first names is where we get some of our first differences. And Severus and Horace are both names of Latin origin, but then we have Professor Sharp come in with the first name Aesop, which is Greek. As I mentioned at the beginning, Snape and Sharp have similar appearances, especially Snape to Sharp's original character model. I think that one looked much more like Snape. Professor Sharp, however, seems to take better care of himself, which isn't really saying much for Snape, as Sharp doesn't appear to take perfect care of himself, and we'll get into that in a moment. Both are relatively tall and thin, with dark shoulder-length hair and dark eyes. However, Snape's hair is described as greasy black hair and his eyes as cold black and empty, like dark tunnels. Sharp's hair and eyes could be described as dark brown. His hair appears rather clean, but in addition to a goatee, he has some stubble along his jawline. Perhaps he skips shaving his jawline because of the scarring on the side of his face, which I'll talk about in a moment, and maybe there's still some pain there, and it's very sensitive and hard to shave. Completely different from both Snape and Sharp, in the books, Slughorn is described as being short and fat, and proud of that.
I am short, fat, and proud of that.
Short and fat, with a bald head, a silver walrus-like mustache, and green eyes. Snape wears a long black cloak that makes him appear bat-like. Slughorn is fancy and well-dressed. Even his PJs are fancy, made of silk and velvet with polished buttons. Sharp wears clothes that seem well-made and fairly fashionable for the time. He has some really nice filigree kind of design on the collar of his coat. Clearly a very, very nice piece of clothing. However, he is slightly sloppy with his dress, despite wearing well-made pieces of clothing. They are not well put together when styled by him, as he has a crooked collar and his necktie is a bit loose. And again, with his stubble, just clearly has the money to perhaps buy good clothes, but not the care to wear them well, if that makes sense. All three are unhealthy to some degree, with Snape being described as having sallow skin. Slughorn is old and sickly, with some asthma and arthritis. As he says, he has a weak chest, he's wheezy, and rheumatism too. Sharp's left leg is injured, and he walks with a limp, and again, as I said before, he also has some scarring on the left side of his face. Snape and Sharp are also both half-bloods, while Slughorn is most likely a pureblood. The reason we know that Sharp is a half-blood, we know why we know Snape is a half-blood. He's the half-blood prince.
I'm the half-blood prince.
The reason we know Sharp is a half-blood is because in the game files for Hogwarts Legacy, there are different tags on the character files, and there are 3 character models for Professor Sharp, and we'll go into this a bit more, but I break down stuff about the different character models that exist. We only see 1 in the game, in my other videos, but 2 of the 3 character models are tagged as half-blood, his adult version that we see in the final game, as well as his young adult self, but his teenage child self is tagged as pureblood. So I'm not sure the reason for the difference, but since the later versions of the character, or the older versions of the character, are half-bloods, as well as the final version of the character, I'm going to go with that he is a half-blood. Discussing Sharp's injury, where his lack of self-care comes from perhaps the pain and maybe some depression stemming from that, and some potential alcoholism. Again, my Professor Sharp deep dive, I go into that, as well as, I think I talk about it in my Professor Sharp 9 Reasons video as well, but it is very heavily implied, and you can assume that he may be an alcoholic. Snape's lack of self-care is learned from being neglected as a child, and he was never taught to care for himself because no one else ever cared for him. So that neglect as a child from the adults in his life, his mother specifically, led to neglect of himself as an adult. So this neglect shows where there may be a divergence in their paths. However, I didn't write this in my notes, kind of thought of this just now. It's entirely possible that maybe Professor Sharp was neglected as a child. We don't know this, we don't get to see this. So a key difference between Snape and Sharp as children in their upbringing is that Snape was very poor, however Sharp was wealthy. Again, in the game files there are tags for what class the characters fall into, and Sharp is tagged as being upper class. I think, again, there's a difference with the child model that I think is lower class, but again, his adult model is tagged as being upper class, and again, his very nice clothes reflect this, that he probably does have some money, some family money maybe, and perhaps he was well treated as a child, but maybe he too was neglected, kind of the poor little rich boy syndrome. You know, parents, what's Remy Bucks Aplenty from Fairly Odd Parents, kind of like that. Need I say more? Just, you know, sort of like a child who grows up rich and wealthy and has everything handed to them, but their parents ignore them. So perhaps even though they have different backgrounds financially, were similarly neglected as children. These three characters have their own desires and goals as well as regrets. Snape's goal is to protect Harry in honor of Lily's memory and as a promise to Dumbledore. So Slughorn's is where it's a bit less clear, not as defined as the other characters, but it would seem at the beginning his desire was to simply enjoy retirement, stay retired, as well as to evade the Death Eaters.
Oh, all right. The Death Eaters have been trying to recruit me for over a year. Do you know what that's like?
And when Dumbledore convinces him to come back to Hogwarts, he seems to be more motivated by money.
And I expect a raise. These are mad times we live in, mad!
As well as the benefits that would come from being at Hogwarts, including protection with the security of the castle, as well as proximity to new, remarkable students like Harry. Sharp's desires are to heal his blasted leg and, in turn, potentially return to his Auror career. There's a strange similarity to their regrets in that they all have grief and death woven through them. Snape's regret is that Lily died and that he wasn't able to prevent her death. Slughorn's is that he gave Tom Riddle the information he needed about Horcruxes to successfully create them, and that in turn, Slughorn is partially responsible for the rise of Voldemort. I almost said the rise of Dumbledore.
Harry, you put your name in a goblet of fire!
For the rise of Voldemort, as well as the deaths associated, the murders he would have had to commit in order to make his Horcruxes. Sharp's regret is that he is partially responsible for his Auror partner's death, and that he had to leave his Auror career behind. The thread of death and regret woven through their lives sets what I like to call a Potions Master precedent. And I introduced this in my Sharp deep dive, but these are things that are repeated in each of their lives that chronologically may have defined elements of the next Potions Master's life, or that the development of one character influenced the development and writing of the next. So I have 5 other Potions Master precedents that I want to go into, and we'll be starting with the first potions class, being the first potions class that the protagonist experiences with each of these professors, either Harry or us as the protagonist of Hogwarts Legacy with Professor Sharp. And each of these 3 first potions classes follow weirdly similar beats, and even in the same order pretty much, starting with Harry's first potions class with Snape during his first year at Hogwarts. Snape takes roll call, taking the opportunity to mock Harry when he gets to his name, then flatly introduces the class.
There will be no foolish wand-waving or silly incantations in this class.
And immediately shares his low expectations for his students, including referring to students as dunderheads. He then begins the lesson by drilling Harry with questions in an attempt to dress him down in front of the class, while Hermione eagerly tries to answer the questions, ready to prove her intelligence. After Harry points this out, Snape snaps at both Harry and Hermione, and this is one of many instances throughout the Harry Potter series where he shows a dislike for the Golden Trio, particularly Harry and Hermione. Harry because he looks like his father and is in many ways similar to his father, James Potter, and Hermione, I guess, because she's kind of a know-it-all, but he, in one instance in Chamber of Secrets, makes her cry because he calls her ugly. Or says something about her having buck teeth. I can't exactly remember off the top of my head, but definitely makes her cry. And I remember reading that as a kid, and I already didn't like Snape, but that was the moment I was like, oh, I really don't like this guy. I just had this thought while editing. Perhaps the reason Snape has a particular dislike for Hermione is because she kind of reminds him of a young Lily Evans, in that she is Muggle-born and is very smart and studious, and because of that comes into the wizarding world with a working knowledge of magic, despite not having been raised in it. and seeing her sitting next to Harry, a young James Potter, just triggered him. And so he started taking it out on her as well. And he also, during this first potions class, shows his preference for Slytherin students, especially Draco Malfoy. Later in the class, Neville and Seamus have a mishap while brewing a cure for boils, and Snape manages to blame Harry. By the time class is over, Gryffindor has rather unfairly lost a number of points. Before we go into Slughorn and Sharp's first potions classes, I just want to go over the story beats that we see show up in Snape's first potions class that will be repeated in the other two. There are 5 of these, and the first is the introduction to the class as well as the expectations of the students, followed by Hermione, or a Hermione proxy as we'll go into, being eager and ready to answer questions and share what knowledge they have about the subject at hand, potions, and then an establishment of student preference, and some sort of mishap, either great or small, and finally the giving or taking of house points. In Harry's first potions class with Slughorn, the students wait outside the classroom and are welcomed in by Slughorn, who prepared some potions ahead of time for them to review. He asks the class what each of the 3 potions are, with Hermione naming each as well as listing their properties and uses, impressing Professor Slughorn. When it comes to the 4th potion, Felix Felicis, he asks Hermione to explain its use, not bothering to ask the entire class this time. As the class is making the draft of living death, Malfoy tries desperately to impress Slughorn, who barely notices Malfoy, giving full attention to exceptionally talented and remarkable students like Hermione and Harry. There are no significant mishaps during their first potions class with Slughorn, though Hermione may argue that not being top of the class and making the best potion would be a mishap. But much of the class fails to make the draft of living death, with Ron's potion attempt being like liquid licorice and tar-like. By the end of class, Gryffindor has earned 20 points thanks to Hermione. And in Hogwarts Legacy, in our first potions class with Professor Sharp, he enters into the classroom while introducing the class, sharing his high expectations for his students. Instead of positing a question to the class, he asks Amit, knowing he is studious and will likely know the answer, similar to Hermione, and Amit, of course, knows the answer. Editing Sarah jumping in here for a second. When I was originally recording the video, I forgot to mention story beat number 3, establishing student preference, and for Sharp, that is that he doesn't have a particular preference for students of any house or for any particular student, just he appreciates if a student is studious. Gareth Weasley attempts to make a potion of his own and ends up blowing up the contents of his cauldron into an explosion of what looks like fireworks. By the end of class, Ravenclaw has earned points thanks to Amit, and Gryffindor has lost points thanks to Gareth. And in Snape's first potions class, or Harry's first potions class with Snape, the loss of points to Gryffindor is rather unfair. The earning of points for Gryffindor in Slughorn's class is fair, and the loss of points for Gryffindor and points for Ravenclaw in Sharp's class are fair, so just another comparison of Snape being a very unfair teacher and Slughorn and Sharp being a bit more fair, with Slughorn maybe being too fair at times, and Sharp being like Goldilocks, the middle ground. The next Potions Master precedent is the Potions Master tenure. Based on my timeline, Slughorn and Sharp were Potions Master for about the same amount of time, in the range of 45 to 50 years. Had he lived his natural lifespan, perhaps Snape would have also been a professor for about as long. The next precedent to discuss is the comparable ages between specifically Snape and Sharp, and their ages are comparable relative to their respective protagonist. Snape is 36 years old during Harry's 5th year at Hogwarts, and Sharp is 36 years old during the Hogwarts Legacy protagonist's 5th year at Hogwarts. The next precedent is pensive memories. Sharp and Slughorn are both heavily connected to pensive memories in the original series, being 2 of only 6 characters whose memories we see. Their pensive memories are so important that the only pensive memories shown in the movies are Dumbledore's, Snape's, and Slughorn's. And the most likely theory for why there are younger character models for Professor Sharp is that we were supposed to see a pensive memory of his, but that was ultimately cut from the game. But again, we see 3 Potions Masters at least potentially being related to pensive memories. And the final Potions Master precedent I want to discuss is the Frollo theory. So, I introduced my Frollo inspiration theory in my Professor Sharp deep dive, and this theory is that Professor Sharp was at least partially based on and inspired by Claude Frollo from the Hunchback of Notre Dame. And I mentioned there that I'd previously made connections between Frollo and the wizarding world, but didn't specify there that that was to Snape. When I was a teenager and read The Hunchback of Notre Dame for the first time, I remember thinking there were some weird similarities and we'll go into this, but when Nicholas Flamel is brought up, my previous knowledge of Nicholas Flamel was from Harry Potter. Rereading the book, looking back through the Harry Potter series, the books and the films, there were other details I picked up on that were weirdly similar. And again, when I was looking more into Professor Sharp, I thought again about this weird similarity I had found between Snape and Frollo, and realized it also applied to Professor Sharp. The first similarity to discuss here is age. Similar to both Snape in Order of the Phoenix and Sharp in Hogwarts Legacy, Frollo is meant to be 36 years old in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Next is physicality, and this only applies to Slughorn, but the two both have very different book adaptations from film adaptations, certainly most film adaptations in terms of Frollo, but one thing that they have in common in the books, not in adaptations, is that they are both bald. One of the more interesting comparisons is in terms of pursuits, and Frollo is a student of alchemy and studies Nicholas Flamel, friend of Albus Dumbledore. Alchemy is taught as part of Hogwarts Potions classes, as well as being a separate class that students can elect to take and is most likely taught by the Potions Master. And alchemy is also discussed in the textbook Advanced Potions Making. Also, all of this makes the people of Paris, including his own brother Jean Frollo, think that Claude Frollo is a sorcerer.
Witchcraft.
Another really interesting one is the potions classroom. The description of the cell in which Frollo studies is a very similar description to that of both the potions and alchemy classroom. Hugo's description of this room comes from the Rembrandt etching Dr. Fautreus, or The Alchemist at Home in His Study, which may also have inspired elements of the potions classroom, as it contains details not described by Hugo in the book, but are present in the potions classroom, both in Hogwarts Legacy and the films. The final comparison to be made is between their obsessive natures, Frollo's, Snape's, and Sharp's. Sharp is obsessed with finding a cure for himself in a way similar to Frollo's obsession with his metaphysical pursuits. And Snape's obsession and near possessiveness of Lily Evans is similar to Frollo's obsession with Esmeralda. So there we have the reverse engineering of a Hogwarts Potions Master. Let me know, as always, what you think in the comments. I love, especially on my Sharp Deep Dive, I'm constantly, even a year later, getting so many comments and just having some fun conversations with people. I love how many people there are out there who want to talk about Professor Sharp, who want to learn more about him. So as always, I love hearing from those of you watching, my fellow Sharpies. So yeah, thank you for being here. Please give this video a like, subscribe, stay tuned for more Sharp content because it is coming. And with all that being said, I'll see you in the next one. Bye. Subscribe!